So welcome everyone. Welcome back to the XPrag wine gathering after a long summer break. It's really good to see you all again now. And today we have a talk by Teresa Guasti and Sauerland, which is also joint work with Artemis Alexiadou as part of their EOC Synergy Grant. And I will start with an introduction of Maria Teresa first.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Nicole gave me the nice job of introducing Teresa, which made me revisit her website and remind me how actually she and I are kind of in certain ways opposites, you know, not only, I mean, in a good way, theoretically, but also in other ways. For example, she's a linguist who works in the psychology department, and I'm a psychologist who works in the linguistics department. But we know that Teresa has worked for a long time experimental pragmatics, and she and Uli obviously have been big contributors, and actually made me look back when one of the first times, I'm not sure it was the first time, maybe the second time, but she came to the very first workshop that we organized, and I went to look up the program. And she gave the last talk on the second day, and the study was experimental. The talk was experimental studies on scale implicatures in children and adults. So she's been with us a long time, and we're pleased that she's been a big part of our community. Off to you, Nicole.
Yeah, so I will also give a similar, more personal introduction to Uli. So Uli is considered as one of the most important semanticists of our time. And he's been the co-founder with Petra Schumacher of the XPrag DE network, so the German XPrag network. He's a group leader at the Center for General Linguistics, and I'm also honored to say that he's been one of the most important supporters of my own career since 2009. So I'm super excited to hear about your joint project now, which is also another big innovation, and will be, I think, a really interesting collaboration from different perspectives. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so
do you see the slide? I don't know where they are now.
You still have the right to share the screen.
Okay, I have to reshare again. Okay.
okay, yeah.
They are here. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ira and Nicole, for organizing this and restarting now, and for the very kind introductions, and thank you all for coming. So what we are presenting is work that sort of tries to specify further an approach that we call a meaning first approach, that is a sort of a slightly different structure of grammar than the mainstream one. And in particular, we are looking there for evidence from language acquisition that kind of is helpful in testing and further developing this approach. So specifically undercompression errors that provide evidence for this approach, or for the elements of this approach. Yeah, this is also joint work with Artemis, and you see, and the one paper that sort of spells out assumptions of this approach is a joint paper by Artemis Alexiadou and myself, and other work. I mean, I should say that this talk that we're presenting is a paper that's almost finished and should be out there before the end of the year, I hope. So the basic idea of the approach is sort of shown in a caricature here, is that they are very complicated thought structures in the human mind that kind of resemble things that semanticists have been proposing, but I mean, semanticists have been proposing many different things, and we need to figure out which one. And these thought structures exist to a large extent independent of communication. And then when people want to communicate these structures, they articulate them. This process of the articulation and so on is rather hard, and therefore they radically compress them. We don't quite know to what extent they compress them, but out comes some kind of little sentence of a couple of words, and the ratio might be of words to sort of underlying concepts might be 10 to 1 or whatever. We don't know at this point. Here, more realistic examples where this seems to be going on, and these are known sort of as decomposition of lexical elements. So, for example, what's articulated as break or broke here would be really pronunciation of two pieces, something cause and broken. The hypothesis that possibly all verbs only can take one argument here. So the cause takes the causa argument, and broken takes the theme argument vase. And that structure that is kind of sketched here in the first line then would be articulated as we broke the vase. Another case that will play a role further on would be antonymic adjectives that we assume would generally be composed out of negation and the positive counterpart. I see that. I'm very happy to see that Eve Clark is here because she worked on antonyms in the 1970s. So John is short, for example, would be when there are arguments already from adult language that is short is the articulation of not or something, a marker of negation and the positive tone. So we don't always have a one-to-one correspondence between conceptual representations and linguistic expressions here. And we need to then sort of find out how the, so we view this we divide sort of up the territory in this approach into three components. One is a generator that generates these conceptual structures or thought representations or something. And these are generated out of primitive logical concepts and then other sort of acquired primitives. And they're some very bare bones rules of composition. And this generator system we see as functioning independent of language, and it's possibly shared also to a large extent with other species, and produces these structures. And then when we want to communicate, we come to the next system, the compressor. And what the compressor then does is the realization of a thought structure, so that another person then can kind of recognize the thought structure that might have been underlying this articulation. And people are sort of kind of lazy about this, that they kind of produce the least material that's necessary under their assumption that another person could recover the intended meaning, or at least come close enough to have the kind of desired effect. So there are, the compressor is sort of governed by this type of economy consideration, but then there are also for each language, sort of not just specific articulation and lexical entries for sort of ways of articulating specific concepts, but then there are also linearization rules that differ, for example, for different languages. So either a verb in front or at the end of the sentence or something. And the last component is the acquirer. And this one would not have to do anything about the logical primitive concepts, but I mean, so it doesn't. They are though the like concepts like car or tea that are not innate and that would have to be acquired. But the generator system, except for these sort of acquired concepts, is we conceive of as being sort of invariant across humans. But then, so mostly the acquirer is relevant for the compressor. So the compression is different for each language. And yeah, and in particular, then when Teresa will go into this into more detail now, the principle of transparency that sort of makes learnability easier, or plays a role in learnability. Yeah. And with that, I think I hand it over to you, Teresa, right?
Yeah. Okay. So as Uli has just said, compression is guided by several principles, one of which is the consideration of learnability. And among the constraint that comes from learnability, one is the principle of transparency that has been already discussed in the literature, and that has a particular role in our approach, because in our approach, the idea is that the concepts are encoded into language in a compressed way, namely in a way in which there is no one-to-one correspondence in general. However, languages are made in such a way that in some cases transparency is honored. Now, acquisition involves finding the mapping between particular concept and their linguistic encoding. And we can suppose then that learning should be easier when the mapping between the concept and the linguistic encoding is one-to-one, which is not often the case, but sometimes it is. So when concepts are not compressed, acquisition should proceed smoothly. When concepts are compressed, as we are hypothesizing for several cases, then acquisition will proceed less smoothly. So the transparency principle then make the following prediction. In comprehension, children learn earlier structure that honor transparency. And in production, this will lead children to produce undercompression error, or often also called in the literature commission errors, namely errors in which children will produce more than adults would do. This leads us to the hypothesis, the child undercompression hypothesis, whereby if a concept is present in the conceptual representation and the language has a morpheme, an overmorpheme to express this concept, and this is used sometimes by adults, then we expect that children will attempt to realize that concept in their linguistic production in a way that adults would not, because they will compress. We think that there is evidence coming from commission errors in the literature that support this view. In language acquisition, in most of the cases, the researchers have concentrated on omission errors, but there are also commission errors that are the focus of our our study. I would immediately say a disclaimer. It is not the case that all commission errors should be treated at the same level, but we think that some of the commission errors that we will discuss could be evidence for undercompression. We will provide evidence from what is already available in the literature from two domains. One is variable binding dependency, and the other are antonymic concepts. I will start with variable binding dependency, and in particular relative clauses. So dependency refers to the relation between two elements, one of which can be a pronoun or a trace, and the other is the binder. So traces and pronouns are both bound elements that have been argued to be complex concepts and that share features with the binder. So this leads to the following generalization. Any concept that can be bound, pronouns and traces, in the sense of variable binding, must share one or more primitive concept with the element that binds. So the two elements in a dependency must share some concept. In the linguistic literature, it has been shown that there are different kinds of dependencies under the name of A or A bar dependency. Now, several work have shown that the number of primitive concepts shared between the binder and the bound element correlate with the structural proximity of the two. The greater the structural distance, as in what is called A bar binding, the greater the structural distance, the more concept must be shared. So this leads us to expect that in the case of these dependencies, children may produce undercompression errors and attempt to honor the principle of transparency, mapping both the binder and the bindee. So given that in a variable binding dependency, there are two sets of concepts, sometimes children will express both linguistically, while adults will compress and express only one. So relative clauses could be an area in which this can be investigated further. And since it has been shown in the literature that children occasionally produce double-headed relative clauses. Here we have example from English, the song about the airplane that we are riding in an airplane, in which you can see that the relative head is double in the subordinate clause. Here we have another example in which the relative head is somehow compressed, expressed by the form of the one, a pronominal form, and the more specific term is expressed in the subordinate position. And here we have example from Spanish and from French illustrating the same point. So these are examples of double-headed relative clause in which you have both the relative head and the bound element expressed, although there might be difference in exactly what is expressed. Here we have two more examples from Mandarin. Mandarin has head final relative clauses. This sentence reads in English, the child that the mother kisses the child. And here you have the relative head, child, and the double in the subordinate clause. And the final example is from German. This is one type of double-headed relative clauses. Another type is one in which the double is not expressed in the form of noun, but is expressed in the form of a pronoun, often called resumptive pronoun. And here we have an example from French and another from Mandarin. To give you a flavor of these double-headed relative clauses, I will briefly summarize a study that has been carried out by Wu, Shenai and collaborator with Mandarin-speaking children. 125 Mandarin-speaking children were tested from the age of 3 to 8, and subject and object relative clauses were elicited. Here are the results. What you can see here is that at the age of 3, subject relative clauses and object relative clauses are very problematic. With age, there is an increase in subject relative clauses, the red bars. Object relative clauses also increase, but they are more problematic than subject one. But the interesting point is what children produced when they did not produce the target structure. Well, children produce resumptive pronoun in object relative clauses. 21% of the non-target responses were relative clauses with resumptive pronoun. And they also produced a high amount of resumptive NP, namely relative clauses in which both the head and the binder are expressed by two nouns, let's say. 50% of non-target responses were relative clauses featuring the presence of two nominal heads. This was mostly found in object relative clauses, but sometimes also in subject relative clauses. We found the same phenomenon also in adults, but only in object relative clauses. 56% of the non-target responses were relative clauses of the kind that you see here, the child that the mother kisses the child, also in adults. This led us to look at, to investigate this behavior of adults through a grammaticality judgment task. And what we found, so this was, we presented subject and object relative clause with gap or with the double head. And what you can see here is that a fair amount of relative clauses, both subject and object, are either completely acceptable or acceptable. So it was a Likert scale. Of course, adults accepted the relative clauses with gap with more frequency, but there was a large amount of acceptance also of relative clauses double-headed. A study that used the same material, a similar material and the same procedure was carried out by Yatsushiro and Sauerland in 2018 with German-speaking children. The age range was smaller. And what they found is that while subject relative clauses were almost at ceiling, object relative clauses were quite problematic. Only 18% of object relative clauses with the target the adult form. 41% of the object relative clauses feature the presence either of a resumptive NP or a resumptive pronoun. Namely, they had two heads or one nominal head and a pronoun. So these, the fact that children produce resumptive relative clauses featuring resumptive noun or resumptive pronoun has led us to the idea that when you have the binder and the bindee, these two elements must share some concept. And here we make the conjecture that in the conceptual representation, they are represented sharing the same number of concepts. What happened is that in general, this element is not spelled out. In other words, is compressed. This is the conceptual representation, and when this is expressed into language, the concept staying for the bindee is compressed. However, what children do is to express also this element either as a noun or as a pronoun, as in the case of the relative head. In other words, we are taking doubling as a failure of compression and an attempt to map the conceptual representation with a one-to-one mapping, honoring the transparency principle. There are not many studies that have looked systematically to this kind of error in relative clauses, and we hope to extend this result to other languages. Interestingly, there are adult languages in which you have double-headed relative clauses, and here I gave some example from 3 languages that are discussed in Cinque and Dreyer. There are some more discussed by this author. One is a Tibetan-Burman language in which you have the relative head here, in which you have the relative head, the demonstrative and the classifier, and the bindee is only the noun. Here you have the relative head is represented by a general term, thing, and the bindee is expressed by the specific term. And here we have an example from Wenjonese, which is similar to the first one. Wenjonese is a language spoken in southern China. So children are similar in this respect to what is shown in these languages. Here you have an example in which both the binder and the bindee are almost identical. The article is changed. And here we have a case in which you have a general term here and the specific term in the subordinate clause. So we can say that here the children are compressing and expressing only a classifier, and here they are expressing something more. So, and this is the end of the first example, and I give the floor to Uli.
Yeah, I think we have only a few minutes now left.
Yeah, 7.
And I will try to do this very briefly, but I'm kind of addressing the first question that is in the chat already, in some way, hopefully. So I mentioned this assumption that negation is always split apart from an antonym. So there's always antonymic relations that so the antonym always has 2 pieces, and we have 2 cases of that we will look at very briefly here. The first one is what in English comes out as without, the antonymic presupposition that's the opposite of with, so in many other languages, in English, this is overtly compositional, consisting out of with and out. But in many other languages of the world, it's just a primitive, like one monomorphemic unit. So in German, it's ohne, in Italian, is senza. And there, we expect, so we assume that the ohne or senza just expresses this negative part, and the part that is the mit, the with, would be not expressed by adults. But we find in German and in Italian now as well, at least, that children do produce kind of the predicted errors, that they produce articulates the with part with the out part, with the ohne part. So they kind of resulting. So and it makes sense that in English you have to always pronounce, the adults also have to pronounce the with part, because the out has other uses in English, but in German and Italian, the ohne or senza only express the antonym of with. The other case, oh no, here, yeah, okay. Yeah, the other case, no, there are other languages that have this property. And at least we have anecdotal evidence in favor of this. And at this point, and then the second case is negative quantifiers. I think there's evidence that in all languages, there aren't any real negative quantifiers, but these are just indefinites with a sentential negation, marker of negation. And in English, you also find children producing negative quantifiers. In English, that may not be so surprising, because English across all dialects seems to have a fairly solid occurrence rate of negative concord in the adult language as well. In German, which is on the next slide, is a bit more surprising, because at least in northern Germany, negative concord doesn't exist. So you only have the double negation interpretation. There is a comprehension study on German children that finds that they do have a negative concord reading, and also Nikolai and Yatswisher report in corpus evidence that German children do produce negative concord structure, so a negation and a negative indefinite with a single negation meaning. Yeah, that we can skip. Yeah, so that's a assumption is that in all languages there's a negation, and then there's what comes out as a negative quantifier, and nobody here is just an indefinite, possibly.
Okay, so concluding, we have shown that some commission error, or as we call them, undercompression error, are evidence that there is more in the conceptual representation that what is encoded into language by adults. And we have shown this with two examples, one from the variable binding domain, relative clauses, and one from the antonymic concept, cum sine and negative quantifier. So child language is particularly important in this enterprise because children, as we said, sometimes may produce more than adults and commit an error. If we look at a single language, take for example the case of without in English, we wouldn't be able to see any error, because this is exactly the expression both of the presence with and of the absence out. But if we look at languages like Italian and German, we see that children produce with, and then the equivalent of without, which is one or senza in Italian. So it's only looking at German and Italian or other languages that we see that children produce something different from adults. Similarly, if we only look at Italian, children will produce negative concord, but then this would not tell us anything. We have to look at languages in which negative concord is not allowed, like German. And so this means that we have to look to some child language, and we can reconstruct a little bit of the conceptual representation. But if we look at as many languages as possible, we probably can have a better representation of the conceptual structure underlying our use of language. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Almost in time.
So we have about half an hour or like 25 minutes for questions. Please put a Q in the chat so that we can determine the order of questions. We will prioritize questions from junior researchers. There was already
There is
one question by Larry, a very junior researcher.
Yes, I'm in my second childhood, as we say.
We have Napoleon.
Also not terribly junior.
We're getting
Yeah.
younger.
if only by default. So shall I
Okay,
start?
then let's go by order of appearance in that case.
In inverse order of juniority. So yeah, that was really nice. I wanted to get back to the question of the representation of antonyms, and we had the case of not tall as the proposed representation of short, and presumably part of the argument for that is what you described as economy considerations. So, you know, if you're doing a tally of the concepts, then you have tall or short and you have negation. And so it would be nice to either have short as not tall or vice versa. And presumably the considerations there for why short would be not tall rather than tall being not short are the standard ones, whether we refer to markedness, or if we're hospital moth, then frequency rather than markedness, positive valence rather than negative valence, depending on what we take as primitives. The ease of learning, so children learn tall before short, conceptual complexity in some cases, and so on. But we can tease these different variables apart, and what we're left with is different categories of so-called antonyms that differ semantically. So tall and short notoriously are contraries and not contradictory. So as Plato recognized, we can't define small as not large, because things can be not large if they're in between, as he puts it. And so similarly, we're only going to get so far and not far enough if we think of short, if we're a child thinking of short as not tall. That has to be unlearned at some point. On the other hand, if you take, say, alive and dead as antonyms, since these are contradictories, that is, anything to which they both apply must be in one category or the other. They must be either alive or dead, leaving aside zombies and so on. It would seem, if anything, that we do better if we're a child to think of alive as not dead, because we often will hear as children that something is not alive if it's a rock or, you know, a pencil or something like that, or maybe even hair. Whereas if something is not dead, then it almost always will be alive. And yet, I don't think it's terribly satisfying to think of dead as a basic primitive and define alive in terms of not dead. When the child is a little bit older, they will acquire odd and even, and conceptually, in some sense, we know that even is conceptually simpler than odd, but you know, do children really learn odd as not even? You know, what's going on in those cases? So all of these cases are a little bit different from each other. And so I'm wondering how you get from the initial statement where you have contraries like tall and short, and you unpack short as not tall, and then you have to do all of the work because that doesn't actually do the job for us. And then these other cases in which you're dealing with contradictories. So I was wondering if you had responses to that.
So Maybe I say something first, Teresa. So, I mean, the cases of adjectives that are adjectival antonyms. I mean, yeah, that's a whole work program and that would take several years to kind of look at this and maybe like try to find similar evidence from child language. I mean, so there's and I mean, I think so in the case of the dimensional adjectives like short and tall, I mean, there's sort of solid evidence from adult language that you have some kind of asymmetry between the two. Always, but in these other cases, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's very tenuous to like order even or pretty or ugly or something. These like, and I mean, there it might be quite conceivable that more is going on than we have said here. So yeah, so but at the same time, I mean, you have to give, I mean, we somehow need to understand why, say, all these children, they can't just learn the concept without as a primitive concept or the generalized quantifier. No one, if we take this evidence seriously, that they always somehow split it into two pieces, split apart the negation. I mean, and then I have to also say that at this point, like from a, like, I mean, I don't have a good theoretical hypothesis why negation has this property that you split it apart. I mean, negation is sort of a very weird operation in general in language, as I mean, you know, but yeah, and so it's kind of, I mean, yeah, at this point, this is also just kind of an sort of an observation that it's kind of, I mean, there is solid evidence also from adult language, from like decomposition tests, that the negation often antonymic concept can sort of take scope independently somewhere and so on, and in some cases, and then, I mean, this case of the without as a mit owner, that there somehow children produce the extra thing, is something that maybe because the prepositions are also fairly frequent, that you observe it's in the second year of life that you find that evidence, and then I don't really know what to do about all the other antonyms.
Is it possible that without and unhappy, say, negatively prefixed adjectives like that, really at some level do contain negation in their underlying structure, but short and young and poor and so on don't, even though if you're poor, then you're not rich, and if you're rich, then you're not poor. But in those cases of contraries where there's no morphological evidence,
but no, I don't think that could be right, because in German it's not prefixed.
That's true.
Antonym of ways, and then also there is this, and Jonathan Borbelik has in his book a section on, I mean, it's not his original, but Hishkanya, where actually the antonym of tall, so short, is untall, really.
Right, and we have examples like that in English, like unhappy and happy are contraries and not contradictories. But I'm just wondering if there's some way of narrowing down the set of adjectives, of marked and unmarked adjectives, so that we don't end up in this situation of predicting things that don't actually happen, or falling short of the predictions that we want to have happen, like with the tall, short, old, young cases. But okay, I've said enough, so let's.
Yeah, Nicole is doing some hand signals, and so
I know that was more like writing and doing this, but no intention here. But I was wondering if Napoleon's question, because yours is also about that case, right? If it relates to this discussion. So maybe you ask your question now, Napoleon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Uli. Thank you, Maria Teresa. Yes, it's from a different perspective. So I've started, following this work that you guys are doing, and I think a big task ahead will be when you have these findings, to be able to, which you have already attested in the research that you showed us, to be able to identify under compression as the variable, right? I mean, the whole point is, to make the argument hinge upon the processes that take us from the logical representation to the language. And I was thinking, okay, in a very simplistic way, I mean, just to share, an interpretation of what's going on here with the cum-sine thing. So, sine, I mean, you're saying sine is not a primitive. I mean, what would be a primitive in the conceptual language would be some kind of conjunction and then a negation. And sine is these things together, without or not with, so if a child, I'm thinking very simplistically here, but if a child is searching for, a way to express in language the with not relation, using primitives, wouldn't we expect children to say things such as nicht mit, or mit kein, or mit nein, mit, like literally taking the words that they know are the primitives in the language of thought and using these. Whereas when you see mit one or say, or what is Italian, something senza, yeah, they're not doing exactly that.
yeah.
I think that's an empirical question. I mean, we found this example. No one has studied to our knowledge, but we might also find something like with not the gem, for example. It wouldn't surprise me too much for Italian. But yes, that's an expectation. But as we said, probably we need to look to more languages we need to investigate this, because as I said, it's something anecdotal at this point. But the variation that you can find, we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there might well be two stages. One where, or like that children already acquire this allomorphy of nicht and ohne in the environment of with. So they pronounce negation in different ways, but then only later they, or no, and in an earlier stage, I mean, you're right about that prediction. There should be really mit nicht or something, but could be that that's too early to detect or something. That could also be, but I do think there are some examples of this, but we have to, we are looking into this more. Yeah.
I mean, there might just need to be some supplementary assumptions there, that one is originally analyzed simply as a negative. And there could be a cross-linguistic evidence that kind of supports this. I don't know. I think there is more. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, and it happens in Greek, by the way, as well. So if you want to add a language with mit one, it's in Greek. Spoken, of course. You know, you would never see nobody would dare write this, but maybe it's on Twitter now or Facebook. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's hear a question also from Asya.
Thank you. I have a small comment and a question. The small comment is about mit ohne. I thought, well, could the children be reanalyzing mit as just as a case marker, and then ohne carries the negation? And since they know that in this construction that when you're supposed to request something with something, since on the butter there is no case marking, then mit becomes the case marker, and ohne is the semantic thing.
But this wouldn't make sense for Italian, for example, because we don't have case marker, and probably also in other languages in which this has been anecdotically reported, you don't have case marker.
I see. Okay, and then the second question is about so these undercompression errors. You've argued that these undercompression errors are evidence of a richer semantic structure that is there, but that we as adults learn to kind of remove right before we speak. And this explanation seems to be quite different from early stories about copy deletion, which were purely structural stories, right? So that the lower copy doesn't get deleted, and therefore both a moved element and the lower copy gets pronounced. And I was wondering what type of data could possibly tell these two explanations apart, or could one be derived from the other?
Well, if the conception of the variable binding relation is correct, then whereby the binder and the bindee have to share concept, then the story is that these elements are in the conceptual representation, and it would, I think, subsume the copy theory, probably. The other thing is that here we have focused on only on dependency and antonym, but there are other cases, for example, in the verbal domain, where children decompose, for example, a causative verb into cause and the result, and they express both the causative morpheme and the result, meaning something like broke, for example.
Yeah. I see. Okay, thank you.
There is a bit more time for questions. I have one. So
there is also one from Martin.
There is now, I saw in the same second. I'll be very quick about the compressor part. You mentioned economy principles. So what are other principles you're looking into for that? So also like classic Zipf's law, these things, or?
For economy, I leave to Uli. I would say that beyond the economy principle, there are learnability principles. One is the one that we have seen, but I think that there might be other constraints, because in the end of the day, the language must be learnable. And so the compression must be such that it is possible to reconstruct the conceptual structure. And for economy, I leave the floor to Uli.
Okay. I mean, the sort of general economy principle we have in mind is something more like bi-directional optimization in some sense, but there's sort of So, for example, for negative concord, it's kind of, I mean, yeah, when in languages where you do have a negation and a negative quantifier, because the negative, I mean, the negation really is redundant, right? Because the sentence is ungrammatical if the negation isn't there. So you might postulate a negation. There's a sort of a tension there. So it has to be also something. So I mean, that would be the story for English. You have a negative quantifier, and because having a negative quantifier in the sentence somehow tells you that there must be a negation around, you don't have to articulate the negation. And now in languages where the negation is somehow very light, maybe, so there's this claim that it's like clitic negations that tend to be give you negative concord there. There's something like Zipf's law or something like these kinds of things might play a role, or something similar might be going on, that a light negation in a negative concord language you escapes this need to compress, and therefore it remains articulated. But yeah, that's a sort of a speculation to some extent based on just my
You also want to allow for
European languages, and
you also want to allow for split concord languages in which the negation, on indefinites after the verb is obligatory, but either optional or non-occurring if it comes before the verb. And it's been claimed that that holds even for speakers who grow up speaking in standard English speaking communities where neither occurs in the adult language. Francis Blanchette argues that there's still this preference for negative indefinites after the verb with an auxiliary negation, but not before the verb. So presumably there's something innate going on there in terms of a preference for that, however we deal with it.
Okay, let's hear a question by Martin.
Yeah, thank you. So fascinating, thank you. So my question is, have you thought about, or maybe even have predictions to some extent about how this could affect language change? Could undercompression transparency somehow affect grammars, and then as we sort of observe language change, could there be something said about that?
We have not really thought about this. So one thing that notice is that, I mean, sometimes these undercompression errors, they somehow seem to occur in adult speech in a lower register to some extent, so not in written language, for example. Sometimes maybe as a sort of imitation of baby talk or toddler talk or something, or sort of to sound a bit childishly. But then, yeah, maybe, I mean, that is sort of a possible trajectory where they then might affect language change if they become somehow from the lower register become popular or something. But yeah, but that's sort of to the extent that we've thought about this.
Okay, Lynn, and then Ira, and last question at the end.
Yeah, this was really interesting. I just wanted to mention an old paper by Fodor and Garrett called On the Psychological Unreality of Semantic Representation. And what they were doing was taking advantage of the fact that as you add additional negations into a sentence, you get a larger increase in complexity as you go. So sort of a nonlinear increase in complexity. And they were looking to see for which negatives you got that complexity. And they argued that it was only for overt morphological negatives, not for purely definitional negatives.
Like bachelor.
Now, I'm not sure how strong their data are, and this was for adults, but it seems to me that it's sort of an interesting line of argument for you when you start looking at larger groups of children, where you may want to know if some of them are behaving differently because they already have the implicit negative, and that might give them a computational advantage.
Mhm. Thank you. So can you repeat Fodor and Garrett?
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
1975. That was the paper I was thinking of when I was bringing up these, ideas that you don't really want a negation as part of short. Their example was bachelor, but I think the same would apply to short or sad. It's just like
Ira?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to, I don't know, along the same lines as Martin, I was trying to think of ways to generalize what you've presented to other topics and thinking of ways to maybe bring it closer to topics and say, more pragmatically oriented topics like, and I had two examples in mind. I wondered if your approach could account, I imagine it counts also for pronouns, because like kids have difficulties with pronouns too when they're younger. And then taking it really far, I'm wondering if in some ways this would even affect the kind of references kids make in the false belief task, because like sometimes, some people argue that the trouble that kids have in the false belief task have to do with being distracted by what they know versus what they attribute to the person that they're being they're faced with. Like how far would you want to take your account?
Well, I don't know how far, we will see. As for pronoun, certainly it will cover pronoun. And in this respect, I was recently involved in a study in which children seem to have a hard time to differentiate different pronouns. For example, null pronouns versus over pronouns in terms of their co-reference possibilities, for example. And I think, well, there is a lot on pronouns, certainly in the adult literature. There is also a lot in the child literature, but still I think that there is a space for some more investigation. For example, exactly the role of the different type of pronouns in relation to the binder, for example. As for the false belief task, honestly, I don't know what I would expect. Do you have in mind something particular?
Well, it's just that there are people who are more in the Gricean tradition argue that what's confusing for kids is not so much keeping track of, where an object might be hidden, but it's more linked to the language that people use when they ask the question. And so they might not have the same reference that the speaker has in mind when the question is asked.
Okay, so it's a problem of reference again. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how we could study that, but we will probably, I mean, it's fall under the problem of pronouns again, or of way of referring that maybe, yeah, it is certainly interesting to investigate. Yeah, thank you.
This has actually sort of come up in a way. We predict that we just assume, I'm not really predicting, we assume that all people have essentially the same thought representations. And in addition to like, so false belief is kind of a domain where it's been argued that language makes a difference to people's reasoning, so that once the plausible embedding is available in the grammar, children perform better on some of these verbal false belief tasks, and no, even like very low verbal false belief tasks even, and so that it initially looks like a problem for sort of our way of thinking about it, where they should all have the same thought representations. But this might be then a case here in where actually having this compression that language provides you with kind of has an advantage, confers an advantage on you, because you can, using language, some of these complex things, like we had this very complex representation at the beginning, and which was not serious, but like the details of that. But yeah, anyway, but you can imagine that that's kind of difficult to remember as a 4-year-old goes through a false belief task. But when you have a sentence to kind of memorize this, that person thinks something that's different from what I think, then it could be easier. It could become easier for the child. And so how did we get to this? I forgot a bit, but yeah, anyway. So that might kind of fit well with the architecture, that the language somehow can provide some scaffolding for doing false belief tasks. I mean, as you know, there's also this evidence that insanely young children can do some false belief reasoning. Okay.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk again and for the interesting discussion. The next speaker is under negotiation, so we'll announce that.
Oh, what can you negotiate?
By email. Yes, and then we'll be in touch about the date and look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
again.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. And you don't have a professor title, Nicole. That's the doctor. On
It's
your
the Potsdam account, which automatically gives you the titles.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming.
You stop the recording. Is it still recording?
Oh, I didn't stop.
Yeah.
Hold on, that's me. Stop recording.
Yeah, some people, I think, are just gone.